The hidden revelation, the ancient Bible stolen from our history. High in the rugged mountains of Ethiopia, a discovery shakes the foundation of religious history. Dr. James Collins, a Western archaeologist working at the monastery of Debre Damo, is escorted by an elderly monk through dimly lit corridors carved from solid rock. The monk quietly unlocks an ancient wooden chest, revealing a yellowed manuscript bound in weathered goatskin. As Collins carefully examines the text written in ancient Gaze script, his hands begin to tremble uncontrollably. He falls to his knees, overcome. Later, when asked about his reaction, the scholar whispers, "What if everything we've been taught about Christianity is only half the story?" This isn't fiction. This is the reality of the Ethiopian Bible. A sacred text so ancient, so complete, and so profoundly different from the version most Christians know that it forces us to question everything about biblical history. While the King James Bible, sitting on bedside tables across America, contains 66 books, the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible holds 88. That's not a typo. 22 entire books of divine revelation have been removed from the Western canon. 22 chapters of spiritual wisdom deemed too dangerous, too powerful, or too contradictory to the established narrative. But time is running out. These ancient manuscripts, preserved for millennia in mountaintop monasteries, face unprecedented threats. Climate change accelerates the deterioration of fragile parchment. Political instability in the Horn of Africa puts these irreplaceable treasures at risk. And perhaps most concerning, powerful religious institutions continue to marginalize these texts, relegating them to apocryphal status despite their profound historical importance. We are witnessing the potential erasure of humanity's spiritual heritage in real time. What exactly are these missing books? The Book of Enoch, describing fallen angels who descended to earth and corrupted mankind. The Book of Jubilees, presenting a divine calendar that redefines time itself. The Ascension of Isaiah, taking readers on a journey through 7 heavens. These aren't mythological additions. Many were widely accepted in early Christianity. The New Testament Book of Jude directly quotes Enoch. Early church fathers reference these texts frequently. Yet somehow, they vanished from Western Bibles. The implications are staggering. If these books were deliberately removed, what truths were they trying to hide? Why would powerful religious authorities decide certain divine revelations were too dangerous for ordinary believers? And most importantly, how would our understanding of God, salvation, heaven, and our own spiritual identity change if we recovered these lost scriptures? These aren't just academic questions. For millions of people of African descent whose spiritual history has been whitewashed and whose connection to early Christianity has been severed, the Ethiopian Bible represents something profound. Evidence that their ancestral connection to the faith runs deeper than slavery, deeper than colonization, deeper even than the European church itself. Ask yourself, why does heaven always look so European in religious art? Why are angels always depicted as white? Why does salvation require rejecting African spiritual heritage? What if the oldest continuous Christian tradition on earth reveals a truth that would transform how we see our faith, our history, and ourselves? The Ethiopian Bible isn't just another version of Scripture. It's a revelation that challenges the very foundation of Western religious dominance. And the truth it contains has been waiting patiently in the highlands of Ethiopia for such a time as this. A time when the world is ready to hear what was silenced centuries ago. Are you ready to discover what they didn't want you to know? The African roots of Christianity, a stolen legacy. While Rome was still feeding Christians to lions in blood-soaked colosseums, Ethiopia was already embracing the gospel. When European nations were still worshipping pagan gods, Ethiopian royalty had already established Christianity as their state religion. This isn't revisionist history. It's documented fact that challenges everything we've been taught about the origins of the Christian faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church traces its lineage not through Rome but through a direct connection to ancient Israel and the earliest apostles. According to both Ethiopian tradition and historical records, Christianity arrived in Ethiopia through the royal court in the 1st century AD. Acts 8:26-40 records Philip baptizing an Ethiopian eunuch, a royal official of Queen Candace, who then brought the faith back to his homeland. Ethiopia thus became one of the earliest Christian nations in the world, officially adopting Christianity around 330 AD, before many parts of Europe had even heard the gospel. But Ethiopia's spiritual connection runs even deeper, back to the legendary union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian sacred texts, particularly the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, detail how Queen Makeda of Ethiopia journeyed to Jerusalem seeking Solomon's wisdom. Their union produced Menelik I, the first emperor of Ethiopia, who later returned to Jerusalem and brought back the Ark of the Covenant, which, according to Ethiopian tradition, remains in Aksum to this day, guarded by a single appointed monk who never leaves the sanctuary. This isn't merely religious folklore. A groundbreaking 2012 DNA study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics revealed distinct genetic links between Ethiopian populations and ancient Semitic peoples, confirming a migration from the Near East to the Horn of Africa approximately 3,000 years ago, precisely when Solomon and Sheba would have lived. The DNA evidence suggests what the Ethiopian people have always known. Their connection to ancient Israel is real, profound, and genetic as well as spiritual. What makes Ethiopia unique in African religious history is that it maintained this profound spiritual tradition without interruption by colonial powers. When European empires carved up Africa in the 19th century, Ethiopia remained independent, successfully defeating Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. While other African nations saw their indigenous spiritual practices suppressed and replaced with European versions of Christianity, Ethiopia maintained its ancient Orthodox tradition, including its complete biblical canon of 88 books. This historical independence explains why Ethiopia preserved texts that Western Christianity systematically eliminated. The Ethiopian Bible wasn't filtered through the political interests of the Roman Empire or shaped by medieval European councils. It remained as it was, ancient, complete, and uncolonized. When Rome was deciding which books supported imperial control and which did not, Ethiopia had no reason to alter its sacred texts to serve political masters. Consider the profound implications. If Ethiopia's version of Christianity predates the Roman Church, and if it maintained its independence from European influence, then its Bible represents something extraordinary, possibly the most authentic version of early Christian scripture still in existence. This challenges the very notion that Christianity is a Western religion and forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The faith practiced by millions of Black Christians today may be closer to its original form than what many white churches teach. What was stolen from you wasn't just books, it was your rightful spiritual heritage. Your ancestors weren't simply slaves or colonial subjects. They were among the first keepers of the Christian faith, guardians of sacred wisdom that the Western world chose to forget. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just add more text to your scripture, it restores the fullness of a spiritual identity that was systematically erased. The question now becomes, what else has been hidden from us? The forbidden books they didn't want you to read. Within the Ethiopian Bible lie texts so profound, so mystical, and so potentially revolutionary that Western authorities deem them too dangerous for ordinary believers. These aren't minor footnotes or obscure references. They are entire books of scripture that reshape our understanding of angels, cosmic order, divine justice, and humanity's place in the spiritual universe. Their removal wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate act of spiritual and cultural control. The Book of Enoch stands as perhaps the most significant of these suppressed texts. Named for Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, who walked with God and was no more, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. This ancient text reveals a cosmic drama that shakes the foundations of traditional theology. It describes the Watchers, powerful angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and produced giant offspring called the Nephilim. These fallen angels taught humanity forbidden knowledge, warfare, cosmetics, metallurgy, and sorcery, corrupting the world before the Great Flood. But what makes Enoch truly dangerous to religious authorities isn't just its supernatural elements, it's its revelation about divine justice. Enoch describes in vivid detail how even the most powerful celestial beings face accountability for rebellion against divine order. No being, no matter how exalted, escapes judgment. Consider the political implications. If even angels face justice for abusing their power, what does that mean for earthly rulers claiming divine authority? What does it mean for religious institutions that claim exclusive interpretive rights over Scripture? The Book of Enoch's authenticity is difficult to dismiss. The New Testament book of Jude directly quotes it, Jude 1, verse 14 to 15. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Origen referenced it extensively. Fragments of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming it existed before the time of Christ. Yet Western Christianity systematically removed it from their canon, while Ethiopia preserved it unaltered as sacred scripture. Equally profound is the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis. This text presents a revolutionary understanding of time itself, not as a linear human invention, but as a divine rhythm woven into the fabric of creation. Jubilees describes a sacred calendar of 364 days, divided into perfect weeks and months that align with cosmic patterns established at creation. While the Roman Empire imposed the Julian calendar, and later the Gregorian, on the Western world, Ethiopia maintained this ancient understanding of sacred time. But Jubilees contain something even more significant, detailed accounts of how angels directly transmitted divine knowledge to humanity. It describes angels teaching writing to Enoch, medicine to Noah, and agriculture to Abraham, suggesting that spiritual wisdom flows directly from heaven to humanity, not exclusively through institutional hierarchies. For church authorities establishing control over access to God, such teachings undermine their power as exclusive intermediaries between heaven and earth. Perhaps most striking is the ascension of Isaiah, which takes readers on a visionary journey through 7 heavens. Unlike the static hierarchical heaven of medieval European imagination, Isaiah witnesses a dynamic spiritual realm of transformation and divine light. The text describes the pre-existent Christ descending through these heavens, taking on different forms in each realm before his incarnation on earth. A profoundly mystical understanding of Christ's nature that challenges simplistic dogma. The ascension of Isaiah reveals a cosmic map of spiritual reality that the Apostle Paul later referenced when he spoke of being caught up to the third heaven, 2 Corinthians 12:2. It presents salvation not as a simple transaction, but as a soul's journey through progressive stages of spiritual awakening. A concept that empowers believers with direct mystical understanding rather than dependence on institutional authority. Other Ethiopian texts like the Book of Baruch, the Testament of Adam, and 1:3 Maccabean offer equally profound revelations about divine justice, prophetic wisdom, and cosmic order. Together, they present a version of Christianity that is more mystical, more empowering, and more aligned with ancient African and Near Eastern spiritual understanding than the institutional Christianity that developed under Roman influence. These books weren't removed because they were false. They were removed because they were too true, too revealing of a spiritual reality that transcended the control of emperors, bishops, and later colonial powers. They offered direct access to divine wisdom without the need for institutional mediation. They emphasized personal spiritual transformation over institutional obedience. And perhaps most threatening of all, they preserved an understanding of Christianity deeply rooted in African and Near Eastern wisdom traditions, rather than European philosophical frameworks. The question is not whether these books belong in Scripture. The question is why they were taken from you, and what spiritual birthright you reclaim when you read them today. The guardians of truth and those who concealed it. Perched 7,000 feet above sea level in the rugged highlands of Tigray, the monasteries of Ethiopia have stood as silent sentinels of sacred knowledge for over a millennium. While Europe descended into the Dark Ages and Rome's influence waned, Ethiopian monks maintained an unbroken chain of spiritual guardianship, preserving texts that the Western world would later reject. This was not merely academic archiving. It was a sacred vigil maintained at tremendous cost. These Ethiopian monks transcribed their sacred texts by hand, spending up to 15 years copying a single Bible. They mixed inks from native plants, prepared parchment from goatskin, and bound their manuscripts in wooden covers adorned with intricate crosses. During the Muslim conquest that swept across North Africa, Ethiopian Christianity survived in mountainous isolation. When Italian forces invaded in 1935, monks hid their most precious manuscripts in caves, sometimes relocating entire libraries under cover of darkness. Some paid with their lives rather than surrender their sacred texts. One particularly moving account comes from the monastery of Debre Damo, accessible only by climbing a sheer 50-foot cliff using a leather rope. When threatened by invaders in the 16th century, the monks chose to fast to death rather than surrender their manuscripts or flee. Their bodies were found surrounding the ancient texts they had sworn to protect, guardians of truth even in death. This level of devotion speaks to the profound importance they placed on preserving these scriptures intact without alteration or compromise. Compare this faithful preservation to what happened in the Roman Empire, where scripture became a tool of political power. The pivotal moment came in 325 AD when Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. Though not established primarily to determine the biblical canon, this council and subsequent ones became battlegrounds where competing theological factions fought for influence. Emperor Constantine, a recent convert who still minted coins honoring Sol Invictus, the sun god, had one primary goal: to use Christianity to unify his fractured empire. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, a political ally of Constantine, later became instrumental in defining which books would be considered canonical. In his Easter letter of 367 AD, he outlined the 27 books of the New Testament that matched his theological positions while rejecting texts that contained more mystical or direct revelations. Meanwhile, Bishop Eusebius, Constantine's biographer and political supporter, classified books as recognized, disputed, or spurious based largely on how well they supported imperial theology. The stark contrast between Ethiopian preservation and Roman selection reveals two fundamentally different approaches to divine revelation. In Ethiopia, the focus was on faithful preservation of all sacred texts, regardless of political convenience. In Rome, scripture became subject to imperial approval, with texts that emphasized direct spiritual experience or cosmic justice being systematically removed. This divergence created two distinct spiritual paths. Ethiopia maintained a Christianity rich with mystical revelation, angelic encounters, and cosmic justice, while Rome developed a more institutionally controlled faith where access to God required proper hierarchical channels. One empowered believers with direct spiritual knowledge, the other established a system where religious authorities mediated between heaven and earth. What makes this historical divide so relevant today is that recent discoveries suggest the Ethiopian approach may have been closer to original Christianity. When the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in Egypt in 1945, and the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran in 1947, these ancient documents contained many similarities to texts preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, but rejected by Western Christianity. Scholars were astonished to find portions of Enoch, Jubilees, and other non-canonical texts that aligned closely with Ethiopian versions. Even more intriguingly, in 2016, a team of researchers using multispectral imaging technology discovered previously unseen text in an Ethiopian manuscript dating to the 15th century. What they found was fragmentary but significant. Portions of a lost gospel that referenced direct spiritual revelations given to women disciples, content that would have been particularly challenging to patriarchal church authorities. This discovery remains under intensive study, with Vatican scholars reportedly examining it quietly while offering no public comment. The Ethiopian Bible thus stands as both witness and indictment, testament to what was preserved and evidence of what was lost. For centuries, Western Christianity dismissed these extra books as apocryphal or pseudepigraphical, implying they were late additions of questionable authenticity. Yet archaeological and historical evidence increasingly suggests the opposite. These texts were not additions to Scripture, but original components that Western authorities systematically removed. For those seeking to reconnect with this unfiltered spiritual heritage, the challenge is not just academic, but deeply personal. These aren't just ancient books, they represent a direct connection to a faith untainted by imperial politics, uncorrupted by colonial agendas, and unfiltered by institutional control. A Christianity that may be closer to what Jesus and his earliest followers actually taught. The guardians protected these truths, The powers concealed them. Now the choice of what to do with this knowledge rests with you. Jesus and heaven, reimagined in the European image. For centuries, Western art has depicted Jesus with fair skin, flowing European hair, and blue eyes, an image so deeply embedded in Christian iconography that many assume it represents historical reality. Stained glass windows, Renaissance paintings, and modern films consistently show a Jesus who looks more like he was born in Stockholm than the Middle East. This wasn't accidental artistic license. It was a deliberate theological and political choice with profound implications. The Ethiopian Bible, however, presents a radically different understanding of Jesus, one firmly rooted in both historical accuracy and scriptural truth. The Ethiopian tradition recognizes what Western Christianity often ignores. Jesus had deep connections to Africa. When King Herod threatened the infant Jesus, his family didn't flee to Europe. They sought refuge in Egypt, where they lived for years among African people. This wasn't a minor geographical detail, but a divine pattern reflecting ancient prophetic words. Out of Egypt, I called my son. Hosea 11:1. This African chapter in Jesus' life wasn't merely a temporary exile, but a formative experience that shaped his earthly identity. Consider that Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross, came from North Africa. Consider that some of the earliest Christian communities flourished in Ethiopia and Egypt, while Europe remained largely pagan. The Ethiopian tradition preserves these connections, not as peripheral but central to understanding Christ's mission and identity. The Ethiopian Bible's description of Jesus aligns more closely with the Bible's own words than Western depictions. Revelation 1:14-15 describes the risen Christ with hair like wool and feet like burnished bronze. Physical characteristics more consistent with Afro-Asiatic peoples than European ones. The Ethiopian tradition hasn't needed to reconcile these descriptions with European features because it never adopted the whitewashed image of Jesus in the first place. Even more striking is how the Ethiopian Bible presents heaven. In Western Christianity, heaven consistently mirrors European political structures. A divine monarchy with God as king, seated on a golden throne, surrounded by courtiers and subjects arranged in strict hierarchy. Angels in flowing white robes resemble European courtiers, while heaven's architecture recalls European cathedrals with their vaulted ceilings and orderly design. The Ethiopian conception of heaven, particularly as described in the Ascension of Isaiah and the Book of Enoch, presents something radically different. Heaven isn't a single static realm, but a journey through 7 interconnected spheres of increasing spiritual glory. It's not built of gold streets and marble halls, but living light and divine energies. Angels aren't merely messengers in white robes, but manifestations of divine power, some appearing as fire, others as light, others as cosmic forces beyond simple human description. In the Ethiopian tradition, heavenly worship isn't performed by choir members in neat rows, but by dynamically moving beings circling the divine presence. The throne isn't a seat of remote judgment, but a center of radiating love. Most significantly, heaven isn't distant and unreachable, but intimately connected to creation through cosmic patterns reflected in nature, sacred calendars, and human spiritual experience. This vision of heaven feels more like the Garden of Eden than the imperial courts of Europe, a realm where divine presence permeates all things, where boundaries between spiritual and physical reality are permeable, where communion rather than hierarchy defines relationships. It's a heaven that looks and feels more like Africa, connected to the earth, vibrant with life force, and rhythmically attuned to creation's patterns. The consequences of adopting the European vision of Jesus and heaven, rather than the Ethiopian one, have been profound and devastating, particularly for people of African descent. When the only legitimate image of Jesus is European, it subtly communicates that divinity itself is white. When heaven looks like a European royal court, it suggests that European social structures are divinely ordained. When angels all appear with European features, it implies that spiritual perfection is equated with whiteness. These theological distortions were weaponized during the colonial era. Missionaries presented a Jesus who not only looked European, but also supposedly endorsed European cultural superiority. indigenous and African spiritual practices were demonized not because they contradicted Scripture, many aligned closely with patterns found in the Ethiopian Bible, but because they challenged European religious control. Conversion often meant not simply embracing Christ, but rejecting entire cultural and spiritual heritages. The psychological wound runs deep. Generations of Black Christians have been taught to worship a white Jesus, pray to a heaven that looks nothing like their ancestral conceptions of divine harmony, and accept a spiritual framework that subtly reinforces their supposed inferiority. They've been told that their ancestral spiritual wisdom was primitive or pagan, when in fact it may have been closer to original Christianity than the European version imported by colonizers. The Ethiopian Bible stands as powerful evidence that Christianity was never meant to be a European religion. It reveals a Jesus connected to Africa, a heaven that reflects cosmic harmony rather than imperial power, and a spiritual tradition that honors rather than erases indigenous wisdom. For those who have felt alienated by European religious imagery, the Ethiopian tradition offers something profound: recognition that their spiritual ancestors weren't on the margins of Christian history, but at its very center. This isn't merely about historical accuracy, it's about spiritual wholeness. When we recover the unfiltered image of Jesus in heaven preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, we reclaim not just lost scriptures, but a lost understanding of divine relationship. One that affirms rather than erases the spiritual heritage of people throughout the African diaspora. Reclaiming our stolen heritage. The path forward. The Ethiopian Bible is not merely an ancient artifact or scholarly curiosity. It represents a profound spiritual birthright that belongs to you. This isn't about replacing one religious tradition with another. It's about recovering a fuller, more authentic understanding of a faith that has been filtered through colonial and imperial agendas for too long. Today, we stand at a powerful crossroads of spiritual reclamation that offers healing, wholeness, and reconnection to truths long suppressed. For people of African descent, this recovery of knowledge is particularly significant. For centuries, Christianity has been presented as something foreign to Africa, imported by European missionaries, divorced from indigenous spiritual wisdom. The Ethiopian Bible demolishes this falsehood. It reveals Christianity as a faith with deep African roots, one that flourished on the continent long before European powers claimed it as their own. Reconnecting with the Ethiopian tradition means healing the false divide between being African and being Christian, a divide created by colonial powers, not by authentic faith. But how do we practically engage with this ancient wisdom in modern life? The path begins with direct engagement with these texts. Fortunately, English translations of the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other Ethiopian scriptural texts are now widely available. The Ethiopian Bible, the oldest and most complete Bible on earth, by Nagash Mulugeta, provides an excellent introduction. From Ancient Texts to Sacred Spaces, by Dr. Ephraim Isaac, explores the living tradition of Ethiopian Christianity. Digital collections from the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library include high-resolution images of Ethiopian manuscripts that allow direct engagement with these ancient texts. More than just reading, authentic engagement means integrating these spiritual insights into daily practice. The Ethiopian tradition offers profound wisdom for contemporary life. Its sacred calendar provides a rhythm that reconnects us with natural cycles. Its understanding of angels and spiritual forces reestablishes harmony between visible and invisible realms. Its conception of salvation as progressive spiritual awakening offers a path of transformation rather than mere theological ascent. Consider forming study circles with others interested in exploring these texts. Unlike institutional religion that often depends on hierarchical authority, the Ethiopian tradition emphasizes community interpretation and shared wisdom. The monasteries of Ethiopia preserve these texts not in isolation, but in communities of practice, where scripture was lived, not merely studied. Today's digital connections make it possible to form global communities of learning that transcend geographical limitations. Remember that this journey may face resistance. Powerful institutions have invested centuries in controlling which scriptures are considered legitimate and how they should be interpreted. Questioning these narratives threatens established theological and political power structures. You may be told these books are non-canonical or apocryphal, terms designed to marginalize texts that challenge institutional control. Stand firm in the knowledge that your exploration reconnects you with one of the oldest, most authentic Christian traditions on earth. This isn't a journey of rejection, but of expansion. You need not abandon your current faith tradition to incorporate the wisdom of the Ethiopian Bible. Many find that these texts illuminate and deepen their existing spiritual practice, providing context and connections previously missing. They offer answers to questions that traditional Western theology often struggles to address. Questions about cosmic justice, spiritual beings, direct revelation, and humanity's place in the divine order. What we're witnessing today is nothing less than a spiritual renaissance. A recovery of ancient wisdom, perfectly timed for a world in desperate need of deeper understanding. As global systems falter, as institutional religions lose relevance, as people hunger for authentic spiritual connection, the Ethiopian Bible offers a path forward rooted in ancient wisdom, yet speaking directly to contemporary needs. This isn't coincidence, but divine timing. These truths preserved for millennia are emerging now because they're needed now. The choice now lies with you. Will you accept the limited, edited version of faith handed down through imperial filters? Or will you reclaim the fuller, richer spiritual heritage that rightfully belongs to humanity, especially to those whose ancestral connection to these truths has been systematically erased? The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just add books to Scripture. It restores dimensions of spiritual experience that belong at the center, not the margins, of authentic faith. The truth was never lost. It was preserved in Ethiopian highlands, waiting patiently for this moment, for you to reclaim what was always yours. As we journey through life's middle and later chapters, many of us find ourselves questioning the spiritual frameworks we've inherited. Perhaps you've spent decades in religious communities that never quite felt like home. Perhaps you've wondered why the divine images presented to you look nothing like your ancestors. Perhaps you've sensed there was something missing in the spiritual narrative you were taught. Your intuition was right. What the Ethiopian Bible reveals isn't just ancient history, it's a living invitation to reclaim the fullness of your spiritual heritage. For those who've experienced the pain of cultural disconnection, who've wondered why their deepest spiritual instincts were labeled as foreign to their faith, this ancient text offers profound validation. The Christianity you were taught may have been filtered, edited, and reshaped through imperial and colonial hands, but the unfiltered tradition still exists. This realization doesn't require rejecting your current faith journey. Rather, it offers the missing pieces that make that journey whole. The divine calendar that reconnects you to natural rhythms, the cosmic understanding that explains mysteries your current tradition struggles to address, the affirmation that your ancestral wisdom wasn't opposed to authentic faith, but integral to it. At this stage of life, we seek not just information, but integration, bringing together the fragments of our experience into a cohesive whole. The Ethiopian Bible offers exactly this, a spiritual framework that honors rather than divides, that includes rather than excludes, that recognizes the divine presence in all of creation rather than confining it to institutional walls. Your spiritual intuition has always been guiding you toward this wholeness. Now you have the historical context to understand why. The truth wasn't lost. It was waiting for you to find it. If the revelations about the Ethiopian Bible have stirred something within your spirit, don't let this moment pass. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated most deeply? What questions emerged? Your perspective matters in this journey of rediscovery. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring hidden biblical truths and ancient wisdom that mainstream history has overlooked. Each week, we uncover another chapter of our forgotten spiritual heritage. This knowledge isn't meant to be kept to yourself. Share this video with family members, friends, or anyone seeking deeper understanding of their faith heritage. Every share helps another person rediscover what was taken from them. And if this message touched your heart, please hit the like button to help others find this content. Together, we're not just watching videos, we're reclaiming a spiritual legacy that has waited centuries to be rediscovered.